Hey there, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. We are back, and we are going to talk about the War for Independence. And one of the biggest questions that people ask when we're talking about the War for Independence is how could the Americans ever have hoped to defeat the mighty British Empire in a military conflict? I mean, America faced seemingly impossible obstacles. When the guns fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775, there wasn't even a continental army. Both of those battles were fought by local militias, and few Americans had any military experience at that point. There was also no method of training, supplying, or paying for an army. In 1775, the majority of Americans were actually opposed to independence, kind of how we talked about last week. And many historians believe only about a third of all Americans actually supported any type of war against the British. So war in general was just an unpopular idea. The colonies also had a poor track record of working together. So how then could a ragtag group of patriots defeat the British? Well, today, that's what we're going to be answering. Now, the early stages of war in 1775 is often described as British military victories and American moral triumphs. Now, the British bested the Minutemen at Lexington, but the relentless colonists did unleash brutal sniper fire on the British returning to Boston from Concord. So that was a moral victory as far as the Americans were concerned. Then, in June of 1775, the colonists failed to prevail at Bunker Hill. However, they inflicted incredibly heavy casualties on a vastly superior military force. So while we militarily lost that battle, we felt like we had gained moral triumph because we made the British lose far more people than we did at that battle. A year later, in 1776, while the British occupied New York, Washington led his army to two surprise victories at the Battle of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton, and that really uplifted morale for the Americans. Now, regardless of all of that, by 1777, the British occupied Philadelphia, yeah, the seat of the Continental Congress, and it basically sent that body into hiding. So the Continental Congress, which was essentially the Americans' form of government, the government for the colonists, for the colonies, had to go into hiding because they now no longer had an established capital or an established place to meet. The British also controlled New York City, and they pretty much had their way in the waters all along the eastern seaboard, mainly because there was no Continental Navy at this time. So there was no way for us to fight the British Navy, which, mind you, they had the best navy in the world and the biggest. Meanwhile, the British began mounting a southern attack from Canada into upstate New York. What this did is it actually threatened to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. 1777 was a pretty scary time in the American Revolution, and it looked like the colonists certainly weren't going to win. On this slide, you will find a video. You can either click on the video or you can click on the link, or if I have to upload this to YouTube, I will have a link for you in the lecture folder, and it'll be a link there so that you can watch this short 11-minute video over the Battle of Saratoga and why it is important. Now, George Washington, having lost Philadelphia, he led his troops to Valley Forge to spend the winter. Unfortunately, none of the world's powers actually came to the aid of the Americans' cause, at least not yet. And why would they? Up until this point, the Americans were losing, militarily speaking. It was one loss after another. So while the Americans felt that we were winning moral triumphs, we were inflicting damage on the British, militarily speaking, we kept losing battles. And so the rest of the world looked at the American Revolution and thought there's no way that they're going to end up winning. But then, in early 1778, everything changed. The French agreed to recognize American independence and formed a permanent alliance with the new nation. Now, the reason why this is important is because you can declare independence, but until an already established country recognizes your independence, you are not actually independent. We will see this again when we get to the American Civil War. When the Confederate States of America declare their independence, which they do, from the Union, they never formally become a nation because no established nation ever recognizes the Confederate States of America as an actual country of its own. So if you don't have an established country supporting your independence, you aren't actually independent. So France agreeing to recognize American independence is incredibly important. Not only that, but this meant that they were going to send us military help and sizable stores of very much needed gunpowder. And the tide now is going to begin to turn. After the humiliating loss at Saratoga, the British grew increasingly frustrated. They soon realized that capturing Philadelphia, the colonists' capital, didn't bring them much of an advantage. And this was really odd because in wars up until this point, if you capture the capital city of a country, usually that country crumbled apart. But that wasn't the case here in the United States because, oh, I'm sorry, in the colonies, because as long as the Continental Army and the state militias remained in the field, the British had to keep on fighting. So it didn't matter that the Continental Congress had to go into hiding. It didn't matter that they had our capital. We had the advantage of geography. Oh, you want to take New York? That's fine. We'll just withdraw from New York. Oh, you want to take Philadelphia? Okay, have Philadelphia. We'll just withdraw further south. And we essentially made the British chase after us. Because as long as the Continental Army was alive, so was the American Revolution. And it seemed like no matter how much damage the British did to the American cities or to private property, the Americans simply refused to surrender. And it's at this point that they realize that this is a whole new type of war. Now, having failed in the North, the British turned their attention to the South. They kind of hoped to inspire the Loyalist support. Loyalists are people who were loyal to the British Crown, among the dissatisfied Americans there. A hope that honestly was never realized. The fighting did continue, and the threat of the French naval participation started to make the British feel pretty uneasy. In October of 1781, the war virtually came to an end when General Cornwallis was surrounded by the Americans, and at sea he was surrounded by the French. And this forced the surrender of the British at Yorktown in Virginia. So this is the Battle of Yorktown. It is a very big deal. It is the moment that we win the war for independence. General Cornwallis, he goes up this hill and he expects his army to peek over the hill and to see, the British fleet at his back, and instead it is the harbor there is filled with French Navy ships, and the Americans are at his front, and he is essentially forced to surrender. And he does. And 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris made it official. America was independent. But we haven't really answered how the Americans hoped to defeat the mighty British Empire in a military conflict. And did we really defeat them in the military conflict? Now, perhaps an even better question to ask, instead of how did we hope to beat the British Empire, was how did the mighty British Empire ever expect to vanquish the Americans? Yeah, let that one sit in. How did the British Empire ever expect to vanquish the Americans? Now, the British did have many strengths, and they seemed to be unbeatable. You're talking during the previous 100 years, the British had enjoyed triumph after triumph over nations as powerful as France and Spain, who were world leaders at the time. At first glance, the odds were clearly against the Americans, and on closer look, we can provide some insight on how these underdogs, the Americans, emerged victorious. First and foremost, let's talk about English strengths, because they're certainly there. Now, the British had the best military in the world, hands down. Their soldiers were well equipped, they were well disciplined, they were well paid, and they were well fed. And obviously, the British Navy had the dominance of the seas. And funds were much easier raised by an empire than they were by the Continental Congress, who was only in charge of 13 colonies, and they couldn't really force the colonies to give them money, and so they just had to hope that the colonies would give them money. Whereas with an empire, you can just tax your other colonies, get that money, and fight a war. The Americans had a tremendous difficulty raising enough funds to purchase basic supplies that we needed for our troops. And by basic, I mean the most basic, as in shoes and blankets. Yep, shoes and blankets. And around 1 in 5 Americans openly favored the crown. They didn't want independence. They didn't want a war with Britain. About half of the population was hoping to avoid the conflict altogether. And most Native American tribes ended up siding with Britain because the colonists had always been pushing into their land, whereas Britain promised protection of tribal lands as long as they helped the British win. Now, on the flip side of that coin, we have some strengths that are just intangible advantages for the Americans. The first one being that the British fought a war that was very far from home. Military orders, troops, and supplies took months to reach their destinations because they were all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. The British also had an extremely difficult objective. What does that mean? Well, they had to persuade the Americans to give up their claims of independence. And like I said earlier, as long as the war continued, as long as the Continental Army existed, the colonists' claim continued to gain validity until eventually the French recognized American independence. So the British had an incredibly difficult objective. How do you take something that you can't really fight militarily away from the Americans? Then we had the advantage of geography. Yep, that's actually an advantage. And the reason why is because the geographic vastness of the colonies proved to be an absolute hindrance to the British effort. Despite the fact that they occupied every major city, the British still remained at a disadvantage. And that's because as long as the American Continental Army existed, the war went on. It didn't matter that they had every major city. To us, what mattered is that the Continental Army survived. Now, last but certainly not least, and probably the biggest advantage that the Americans had was that of a grand cause. They were fighting for their rights, their independence, their liberty. This cause is much more than just waging war to deny independence. You know, the American military and its political leaders were inexperienced, but they proved to be surprisingly competent. And part of the reason why is because they had the idealism of a grand cause, right? This was about their lives. It wasn't about land. It wasn't about any of those things. They made the people fighting this war believe that this was about life or death for them. And those are some really, really important American strengths. This war was expensive, and the British population debated whether or not it was necessary after a certain amount of times. In Parliament, there were many American sympathizers. And finally, the alliance with the French gave the Americans courage and a tangible threat that finally tipped the scales into America's favor. Now let's talk a little bit about how this war impacted society, because the social impact of the American Revolution is incredibly difficult to define, but it's something we really need to talk about. On the surface, the revolution really did little for ordinary people because it had never initially promised to. It had been sparked by opposition to unfair taxation, standing armies, and an oppressive government, not the mistreatment or the rights of the poor, women, enslaved peoples, or Native Americans. And that's really important to remember, you guys. Even though we have this grand concept of, oh, it was for freedom and liberty and whatnot, keep in mind that the revolution wasn't sparked by ordinary people. It was sparked by rich white men wanting to keep their land and not wanting to be taxed on it. So, to be honest, our government didn't even bother to think about the mistreatment or the rights of the poor, women, enslaved peoples, or Native Americans. If there were any social changes, they were incredibly subtle, they were complex and incidental, rather than being an explicit aim of the revolution. And the first one we're going to talk about is slavery. Slavery was undoubtedly weakened by the revolution simply because of revolutionary ideas and the war for independence. Because keep in mind, how can all men be created equal, and then you have enslaved peoples? How can you be fighting for liberty and freedom and justice and all of these ideological war tools when you have literal enslaved peoples underneath, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all of, these great founding fathers literally had enslaved people. So how are they fighting for liberty and freedom when they have people who are slaves in their lives? So yeah, in a lot of ways, even though it weakened slavery, it really also fortified it in our new society. The stirring rhetoric of documents like the Declaration of Independence led many slaves to seek freedom, either by escaping or enlisting in the Continental Army or in other various militias. And the numbers of free blacks in America does increase almost triple-fold because of these actions during the Revolutionary War. Now, the wiser revolutionary leaders recognized the hypocrisy of demanding liberty while keeping people in literal servitude. However, most of the loudest voices, like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, kept slaves all their lives and simply didn't have the courage to step towards emancipation. There are going to be abolitionist movements which had been in existence since before the 1770s, largely among groups like the Pennsylvania Quakers, but that is going to increase after the Revolution. So during and after the Revolution, we do see an increase in abolitionist movements. The movement to, make sure that there are no longer enslaved peoples. That's what emancipation is. That is what abolitionism is. And yet, despite these advances in thinking, right, of liberty, of all men are created equal, the liberation of Africans from slavery, the institution itself just remained as strong as ever. And this was particularly true in the southern states where, according to Southerners, slavery was essential because of the labor-intensive methods of farming and the lack of a significant white workforce. So they said we have to have slaves or we simply can't economically produce what we're producing now because there aren't enough white people to work. And the South defended slavery so rigorously, so much, that it actually was factored into the Constitution. And it was factored into the Constitution via the 3/5 compromise, which we will talk about later, not right now. Now, the Constitution also allowed the slave trade to continue, although it came with an asterisk, okay? The slave trade could only continue for another 20 years, and then once that 20 years was up, the slave trade was supposed to stop. So this meant that in 1807, importing slaves or enslaved peoples into the United States became illegal. Okay, let's talk about the impact of the war on women, because even though women make up about half of the population now, and they did then, they benefited very little from the revolution. Thousands of women assisted in the war effort. They dutifully followed regiments. They worked in encampments as cooks, as nurses, as seamstresses. And there are actually some stories that tell of individual women like Deborah Sampson and Molly Pitcher who actually joined the fight, although this was in extremely rare. This was not very common. Now, it's also unclear whether or not these women actually identified as women at all. Recent insight by gender studies scholars do show that these two women might have actually identified as trans men, which made them men fighting in a war, not women fighting in the war. Regardless, it's something to take note of. So either they were women who joined the fight or they were trans men who joined the fight, which is also a really neat little piece of history there. Because guess what? Trans people have been around since the dawn of time, you guys. That's not anything new. Now, despite their contribution, women's contribution to independence, women remained invisible in the new society in terms of citizenship. No woman held office in state or national government. No woman practiced the law or enrolled for college education because we couldn't. And then there were few women who engaged in public debates about the revolution, the ratification, and Reconstruction. However, they were few and far between, and they were considered to be hoodlums, right? Troublemakers. There were some reformers, like a man named Benjamin Rush, who talked about education for women. But when he started talking about education for women, it's not in the way you're thinking. It was education in manners and the fine arts and other womanly things that he had in mind. And others scoffed at the idea of any education at all for women. When it came to asking the president of Yale University whether or not he might allow women to be permitted to attend his college, he replied with this, quote, "But who would make our puddings?" That is one of the most sexist things I've ever heard. Make your own damn pudding. Anyhow, in the new Republic of the United States, women were co-signed to a very similar role as they filled in colonial society. They were wives, mothers, household managers. They were the fairer, gentler, and weaker sex, and they had no place in politics, in education, or anything else that was just for men. And last but certainly not least, the revolution had an almost entirely negative impact on Native Americans. Most tribes found themselves fighting alongside the British, pinning their hopes that the English would actually, end up being victorious and would therefore restrict the expansion of the 13 colonies and provide some sort of protection to tribal lands. Obviously, that didn't happen. Now, the tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy participated in devastating raids on colonial settlements in the Northeast, and that prompted Congress and George Washington to undertake some retaliatory campaigns, such as the Sullivan expeditions, where they quite literally wiped out native villages and farmland. And I mean wiped them out. Okay, men, women, children, elderly, it didn't make any difference to them. They just obliterated them from the face of the earth. Now, the increased movement generated by the Revolutionary War brought the natives into contact with more white people and therefore white diseases. And with no immunity to European diseases, many tribal populations were decimated by these diseases again, particularly smallpox, which ravaged the eastern side of the continent during the 1770s. It killed all of them again. Gosh, they just can't catch a break, you guys. When the British signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783 to formally end the conflict, they also signed over vast regions of tribal lands that didn't belong to the United States to the newly formed United States. The Americans, first and foremost, never recognized native claims to the land anyways, which is laughable because they were here first. But that's beside the point, right? No flag, no land. No, just kidding. Anyways, so since the Americans never recognized native claims to land ownership, and the treaty simply formalized this perspective in the eyes of most Americans, they now viewed the natives as a conquered race and that they were living illegally on American land. What I have to say to that is there's no such thing as a legal person on stolen land. And we're going to leave it at that. Now, over the next century, waves of settlers are going to start moving westward. They're going to claim and they're going to occupy native territories. They're going to displace tribal groups, and they're going to engage in several, quote, Indian wars. Although the national government sometimes sought to obtain this land legitimately through treaties, settlers and state governments instead preferred to just drive off the natives through intimidation and violence. And for the most part, that's the way it went. The American Revolution therefore unleashed a wave of expansion and resettlement that is going to drive most Native Americans from their homeland into a century of disposition and disorder and death. Okay, everyone, that is all I have for you this week. This is a pretty short and sweet week. Just because, I felt like I got a little bit behind last week and I didn't have a whole lot of time to fluff up my lectures on the actual military history behind the American Revolution. Make sure that you do your readings. Make sure that you take your content test by the end of the week. And I hope you guys are all well, and I will see you next time when we talk about federal and state constitutions, and that will be next week.